Chicago Tribune, and second in his heart only to the Tribune was the 1st Division of the United States Army, in which he served as an officer in World War I. This place is called Cantigny, not Cantigny. It's called Cantigny, which is a derivative of a French name, which is a tiny little village in France where the 1st Division fought its first battle of World War I, and he served there. And when he came home from the war, he renamed this estate Cantigny. When he died in 1955, he left a very considerable fortune to establish what our parent organization, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation of Chicago, and he said, leave my estate in Wheaton, Illinois as a public park for the people of Illinois. And so that's why the Tribune, McCormick, Cantigny, and the 1st Division are all kind of wrapped together. As part of our educational mission to present military history using the example of the 1st Infantry Division, we have evening lectures like this. The 1st Division, I'll say just a word about it. It was organized, the 1st Division is called the 1st Division because it's America's 1st Division. We didn't have any divisions before. A division is about 20,000 soldiers. We still have divisions. We didn't have any of those before World War I. We sent 49 divisions to France in World War I, and the first one, we numbered them as they went. And the first one was the first, and then there was the second and the third. This is an army, you know, we got a smart army. But the 1st Division that was organized on June 8th, 1917 is America's 1st Division and has been on continuous active duty every single day since June 8th, 1917 and is currently deployed to Afghanistan. Thousands and thousands and thousands of brave Americans have served us valiantly in the colors of the 1st Division. And so that's why we are here. Now, for much of the 1st Division's history, it is a story about men, and not only men, but Caucasian men. It wasn't until 1948 that the armed forces were integrated. The first racially integrated army we ever sent to war was the army we sent to Vietnam in 1965. Prior to that time, the armed forces were segregated, racially segregated, and the combat divisions almost exclusively were white men, and people of color served in other formations. Likewise, as you're all well aware, it's been into our own lifetimes that women have appeared in large numbers in uniform on the battlefield. And today, about 15% of the soldiers who serve us in Afghanistan and until very recently in Iraq were women, and women have served in every single specialty that to which they have been assigned, and they have served valiantly, proudly, and well. So it's incumbent upon us to try to include the history of the people who are not the core story of the 1st Infantry Division, and so in that vein we welcome tonight's speaker. Catherine Atwood is an educator. She is a native of this area. She grew up in Western Springs, now lives with her husband John in Forest Park. She is a piano teacher. She is a self-taught historian, and she'll talk for herself on what drew her to this particular topic. She and her husband, I think John's here. John, where are you? Up in the back, that's John. So John and Catherine together are the history singers. They have beautiful singing voices. They sing as a duet. And I was really delighted a couple of weeks ago to attend a Pillars of Honor event. I can explain that afterwards if you're interested in it, in which they were featured, and they both did beautifully, and Catherine has just a lovely singing voice. This is her first book, and it gives me particular personal pleasure to introduce her because of the 347,000 women who served in the armed forces of the United States in World War II. One was my mom. I'd like to introduce to you Catherine Atwood. Please welcome her. Catherine, nice to have you.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here, and it's so nice that so many of you turned out. I hope you enjoy the program. Women Heroes of World War II was published March 1st of last year. And it just went into its second hardcover printing. So it's printed 5,000 copies, which is kind of cool. And a lot of those copies have gone to libraries. And it's a young adult book, technically, although I've heard that adults enjoy it as well. But I believe that it's on young adult shelves in libraries across the Chicagoland area, which gives me a big thrill because I know that young people are at least exposed to it. So I hope a lot of young people are reading it. Actually, last month, Women's History Month, my husband and I went and I did a talk at an Eisenhower Public Library, and a little 10-year-old boy walked in clutching a library copy of the book. It was older people and then this 10-year-old boy, and he was asking me questions afterwards, and he left with his own copy, a complimentary copy. I thought that was so adorable. But since I have, and I think I will give you this clicker. There you go. Since I've written the book, I've been asked basically 4 questions. The first is, how did you first become interested in World War II? Because, as Paul mentioned, I am not a historian. I majored in English literature. I minored in history. Started out as a history major, found I liked literature better. But I am not a historian. So how did I become interested in this topic in general? The second question is, how did I choose the women for inclusion in the book? And a more recent question was, what inspired each of these women to go against Hitler? What inspired them to resist? And then the fourth question usually is, what are you writing next? So this program will answer those 4 questions, and it'll also give you a little bit, I'm going to give you a little bit of something called Touching History, which is a bit of the excitement I experienced in meeting some of these women, not in person, but I communicated with some of them, and I communicated with some of their children and their friends, and it was extremely exciting. And that will be part of the program as well. So the first slide, how did I become interested in World War II? The young man on the far right is my father. He was a tail gunner, a waist gunner, and a bombardier on a B-26 in the European theater, and they flew missions over military installations in Nazi Germany and occupied France. He was very young. Next slide. We have so many pictures of him posing in front of planes. I didn't even realize it at the time, but this is the plane scorecard. And each of those bombs is either a mission, a bomb dropped, and you notice there's 4 swastikas on there, so that must be 4 German planes that they shot down, that particular plane. And he's got a big smile on his face. I did a blog, I've got a blog called Boys of World War II, and I did a whole post on these pictures of my dad posing in front of these planes. It was a big adventure for him. A lot of the veterans came back, they did not want to speak about it. He had 3 older brothers, also in the Army Air Corps. And one of the older ones was actually shot down over Romania. He did not want to talk about his experiences. My dad, on the other hand, he was in for the last 6 months of the war, thousands of feet above the air, and he was very willing to talk about his 2 big stories were he had taken all the pins out of the bombs, and then they flew over, they missed the target, so he had to put each pin back into each bomb. And he thought that was amazing. The other one was a little more hair-raising. They opened the bomb bay door while he was standing or too near the bomb bay door, and what happened was he was hanging inside the plane by 2 hands and 2 feet while his abdomen was getting a little air conditioning. So I'm not sure how he got out of it, but he did. The reason I know those stories, I believe he was telling us these stories as we were children, but especially I interviewed him when I was in 7th grade. We had to do a paper on someone that we were very proud of. And so I remember him standing there telling me these stories, and he was so proud to tell me these stories. And that paper got me an A, and I'd like to tell you more about it if someone wants to remember and ask me during the Q&A. This is a story for teachers, but it's not really related to this particular topic. So ask me about Mrs. Jaeger, and I'll tell you after the program. Okay, so the next slide. I'm getting a little warm up here. Here he is on the far right again, standing. This is obviously at the end of the war. And he was 19 years old when this picture was taken. So he was just barely got out of high school, barely got in, followed his 3 brothers into the Army Air Corps. And I believe he spent the rest of his life, I think, trying to understand what he'd been part of. This huge global conflict of good and evil, and there he was, a 19-year-old, last 6 months. How did he wrap his brain around the whole topic? Well, he watched a lot of TV. He was always watching World War II movies, always. And he also watched a TV show called World at War, a documentary show from the 1970s. And I used to watch it with him. And I found it very fascinating. Just, you see this on History Channel all the time now, but back then there was just the one show. And I remember distinctly several images. One was the kamikazes. They had to have a ritual, and they were drinking tea, and I just remember that before they did their suicide mission. The other was images of the Holocaust. I'd never seen that before. We weren't necessarily taught the Holocaust in Illinois like they are now in 8th grade. It's required. So that whole topic began to become very interesting to me all through my childhood. Next. And when I was in high school, the story of this woman came to theaters, Corrie ten Boom. She was a Dutch rescuer. And I was raised in a world where we were all second-generation Dutch Americans. All of our grandparents came from the old country, went to church with the same people, we went to school with the same people. And so when this woman's story came to theaters, we thought that she was one of us. But her story did more than just inspire ethnic pride. Her story left a permanent question in my mind. What kind of person would you have to be, or what kind of character would you have to stand up to an oppressive regime that could shoot you dead on the spot for breaking one of its laws? And she broke a huge law. She was rescuing Jewish people. So that story stayed with me forever, really, for a long time. And this book that I got to write decades later gave me the opportunity to explore this idea 26 different ways. So it's been very exciting for me. And I also read this book in high school, Hansi, the Girl Who Loved the Swastika. She was not a female heroine by any means, but she was a girl who fell in love with Hitler, was raised in the Hitler Youth, and it's a very chilling portrayal of how, through this one woman, this one young girl's eyes, somebody could fall in love with Hitler and feel like they were part of something very special. Now, here is a tiny little, I know some of you are teachers. Are there any teachers here? Would you want to raise your hand? A lot of, okay. Little teacher footnote. I became interested in World War II not because of nonfiction books. If someone had handed me a book on the Hitler Youth or the Dutch Resistance or the Air War in Europe, I would not have touched the books. But I became interested in those subjects because I was interested in certain people within that historical framework. Maria Ann Hirschman, my father, and Corrie ten Boom. And you probably know this because I know my kids, when they were in school, they had to do reports on certain people. But if you're interested in a certain person within a historical context, you become naturally interested in that historical context. It kind of gives you an itch to learn more about what made this person tick, what was it about their environment that made them do what they did. So that's just something I remember from growing up. So I wrote the book for young people to get an itch to learn about World War II because the women are compelling. It is not historical fiction at all. There's no fiction in it, but I arranged their biographical facts in such a way to make them want to read to the end of the story. And even if they don't read the introduction, I never read introductions when I was a kid, on each different country, they are going to learn something about that country from the woman's story. So I was really excited to write for my own clueless, undermotivated 12-year-old self in writing this book, and I think it succeeded to some extent. Now we're going to skip a few decades, and it was 2005, I think, when I started to finally give myself the opportunity to take myself seriously as a writer. And that's not as easy to do as you might think because you have to devote time to it. You have to discipline yourself to spend a little bit amount of time every week, every day. But I really wanted to write, so where I started was writing book reviews, and that's a great place to start if you're interested in writing nonfiction. Do book reviews. It's a lot of fun to get free books in the mail. A lot of fun. It can be too much fun, actually. But I started doing a lot of book reviews, and I tried to write for it in a magazine called Learning Through History. And one of the articles I wrote was about the USO and Marlene Dietrich. And I discovered that she was not just a pretty face or a great actress, but she had given up her German citizenship after Hitler came to power. He came all the way to America through some emissaries, and he requested her to come back to Germany and make films for the Third Reich. And she said, no, never. She gave up her German citizenship, became a US citizen, joined the USO, and then when the boys went overseas, she followed them, and she actually was in very great personal danger during the Battle of the Bulge, when they were all surrounded by the Germans. She was considered a traitor, so she was in serious trouble at that moment. And the next slide, I also wrote an article about this girl named Sophie Scholl. She and her brother Hans and their friend Christoph and a couple of other students, they were students at the University of Munich. And they had this idea that they could write these leaflets of protest against the Nazi state. And if they sent these leaflets to professors and university students, the brightest and the best in Germany, that they could convince them that the Nazi state was evil. So it's an incredible story. They were incredibly idealistic, and Sophie Scholl is actually one of the most, I think she's the most inspiring figure in Germany, still to this day. She would have been in her 90s at this point. But it was just a very exciting story to me. So I wrote these two articles. They were ultimately rejected. They made it through the first round of edits, and rejection is so difficult to deal with, especially when you put so much work into something. But a couple years later, when I was talking to an acquisitions editor from the Chicago Review Press, we were talking about different things that I could write, and these two rejected articles became sample chapters. They really liked the sample chapters, and I had myself a book contract in the fall of 2008. Chicago Review Press, if you're interested in, if you've got an interesting idea for a nonfiction title, they take first-time authors, so they're very open-minded. So I was on my way. I spent 2009, the entire year, writing the book. 2010, we had, off and on, we had some editorial discussions, and then, of course, it came out in 2011. So now the second question, I think, is how did you choose the Women for Inclusion? These are not women, obviously, but I have to discuss a couple of organizations that'll make more sense. Excuse me. The Special Operations Executive was a wartime organization started by Neville Chamberlain. You usually think of him as the peacenik that gave Hitler, in 1938, he gave him the Sudetenland. But he learned the error of his ways, obviously, and he came up with the idea of the Special Operations Executive, and then Winston Churchill put it into practice. So what it was a resistance organization that would train agents in Britain, people that could almost pass, they were trying to pass as native speakers of the particular Nazi-occupied country. And then they would send those agents in, and they would try to find people who would work for the resistance, and when they got a network or a circuit of people, London would send them supplies and organize them, all mostly in light of D-Day, when there would be a mad rush to whatever coast the Allies would land on. They wanted all these agents supplied and trained so they could cut the German communications and transportation, the mad rush to the German coast that would inevitably follow the D-Day invasion. So that was the Special Operations Executive. The next one was the Office of Strategic Services, which was an American organization, the precursor of the CIA. Before the OSS, as it was known, each branch had its own espionage, but now it came under one organization, under the command of the Joint Chiefs. And this is a picture of Bill Donovan. I couldn't fit a really good picture of him on the screen, so here he is giving an award to Virginia Hall. We'll talk about her in a minute, but This was mostly espionage, although during the war they did a little bit of resistance work as well. So the SOE did a little espionage, they did a little resistance work. And now the next slide. Now, this young lady was neither part of the SOE or the OSS, but how did I choose the women? I had her memoir already, and I had read it in the 1990s. Her name is Diet Iman, and she was a Dutch resistor. She was 20 years old when Hitler invaded the Netherlands. And I want to talk about, I'm going to hopefully try to remember what inspired or motivated each woman to become involved. What motivated her was pure arrogance of Hitler. How dare he come into our country and just tell us what to do, change our laws, goose-step through our streets. She was so upset, she swore when she saw the Germans goose-stepping through her town, she said, I'm never going to speak a word of German, even though she could fluently. That actually helped her later on, because when she was caught, kind of gave that away, she was caught at one point, and she was being questioned in German, and then, could you please translate it to Dutch? So she had a little bit more time. But so she wanted to do something, anything, but when so she did this and that, but then when the Germans enacted the anti-Semitic laws in the Netherlands a few months later, they invaded May 10th, the anti-Semitic laws were put in place, limiting all the rights of the Jews in the fall of that year. She had a Jewish friend, and so he needed a place to stay, so that got her involved with rescuing Jews, finding homes and places, hiding places for the Jews. And I'll talk a bit more about her later. Now this lady, I always try to make this brief, but she's really complicated, very interesting woman, Nancy Wake. The reason that she is included, she's one of the highest decorated women in the history of World War II. She was born in New Zealand, raised in Australia, and when the war broke out, she was a journalist in France. And in the 1930s, all these horror stories about how the Nazis in Austria and Germany were treating the Jews were pouring out of those countries into France. So she and her fellow journalists went to Austria and Germany to see if these stories were true. Well, there in Vienna's main square, there was this enormous wheel that I can't quite picture, but this is what it was. There was an enormous wheel. There were Jewish men chained to the wheel as it was moving, and Hitler's brown shirts, or the SA, were whipping them as it turned. And this is a very public event, and Nancy Wake said in her memoir, she said at that moment she was going to do whatever it took, anything big, anything small, to make things difficult for their rotten party, the way she said it. So when the war broke out in France, she was married to a wealthy businessman in Marseille, and she became a courier ferreting documents from place to place, which was very crucial in the resistance to just maybe take a message or documents, because phone lines were tapped, mail was gone through. And she did such a good job that she started to actually ferry trapped Allied servicemen as well from place to place until they could escape over the Pyrenees into neutral Spain, where they could usually get to London. So she was very successful as a courier, and her work became known to Gestapo, and it's, descriptions of this woman who kept eluding them started to circulate. This they called her the White Mouse because she kept eluding them so well. And she had to leave because her mail was sorted through and her phone lines were tapped. She was coming under suspicion for being the White Mouse. So she escaped on one of her own escape lines. It wasn't really hers, but the ones that she had worked on. And then she went to London, and in London, the SOE found her, had already heard about her. They trained her as an agent, and then she came back into occupied France in the south, where there were in the south of France, there were many groups of French men who were trying to avoid being forced to work in German factories, because the German men couldn't work there because they were all in the military. So the Allies wanted to use these men because they were ready to fight. They did not want to work for the German war machine. And they lived in rural areas, and they were called the Maquis. The Maquis. My husband speaks French. I always pronounce that wrong. They were called the Maquis. And Nancy was a liaison officer between thousands of these men, and they came to greatly respect her for many reasons. She could keep them supplied. She also had an enormous tolerance for alcohol, which is not in my book. But for some reason, the guys really thought that was cool, and so she was very highly respected, highly decorated. She just died last year in July, just shy of her 99th birthday, so she was an amazing woman. And I promise none of them will be that long. This woman was an American. She is Virginia Hall, and she was her motivation for fighting the Nazis was that she was basically a European. She had been living in Europe for 10 years before the war broke out. And during the Battle of France, she was an ambulance driver, which might not sound like a big deal, but she had only one leg below the knee. Her left leg had been decimated by a shooting accident. So she did whatever she could, and she eventually came out of France and she learned about the SOE. She's one of the only women who was trained as an SOE agent organizer or leader. Most of the women were trained as couriers or radio operators, people who would communicate by Morse code from wherever the circuit was to the offices in London, so London could keep them supplied with drops from airplanes. So she was one of the first organizers just because she was already on board and the SOE was still getting started. So she did great work in Lyon, the Lyon area, where she became known to the Gestapo as the lady who limps. And they thought she was Canadian because she had a slight accent. So when the Germans, there were two sections of France during the war. There was the occupied northern and western section, and then the southern section, which was unoccupied. It was Vichy France. It was run by Pétain. Marshal Pétain, who was a hero of the First World War, which was, everyone thought, well, maybe this is good because he's our big hero. He eventually really wasn't. He was a puppet for the Nazis. But when the Germans, when the Allies invaded North Africa, then the Germans decided to occupy all of France. And when they came into the south part, the Gestapo was looking particularly for her, the lady who limps. So she had to get out. She got out on the last train. She made it across the Pyrenees with her wooden leg. She didn't tell the tough guide that she had a wooden leg because he didn't even want to take her because she was female. So she kept the wooden leg a secret, but she made it. She was just an incredibly determined woman. When she got back to London, she became part of the OSS. So then she thought, oh, I should work for the Americans. So then she went back into occupied France disguised as an older woman, and she continued to work, do amazing work for the resistance there. So she's quite a woman. And does anybody know who this is? This is Irena Sendler. I always said Irena again. This is Irena Sendler. Now, you might know about her. The reason you know about her is because of 3 high school students who did a year-long National History Day project. Their teacher said, here's a few paragraphs from U.S. News and World Report about a Polish social worker who apparently rescued 25 children, 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. And so they did research on this woman. There wasn't much they could go on, but they eventually found out more about her. They created a play called Life in a Jar, because she would take the names of these Jewish children, their real names, their fake Christian names, and where they were hiding, and she placed them identical information to jars, and she hid the jars. So they called it Life in a Jar. And her story, because of these 3 high school students, her story came to the world. She was nominated in 2007 for a Nobel Peace Prize, but she lost out to Al Gore that year for his film about global warming. You might ask why wasn't her story more well known? Well, because Poland was handed over to Joseph Stalin at the end of the war. The Poles did incredibly, they were just incredible allies of the Allies during the war. 20% of the RAF, I can never remember if it's just the flyers or the pilots of the RAF were Poles. They had escaped Poland, but we just handed them over to the Allies after the war. And so the people that had been involved in the resistance were considered enemies of the state, as were the Jews. Very sad story, but I'm glad that we finally know who this woman is. And next, here's some children of the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. Does anyone know who this is? Hey, very good. You might think she was just a pretty face or just an interesting dancer, but she was born in East St. Louis, 1906, and then one thing led to another. She was very interested in dancing. She became the toast of Paris in the 1920s and the 1930s because Parisians were fascinated with anything African American. They thought of her as African. She's born in East St. Louis, but very, very flamboyant personality. She had a developed singing voice as well as dancing. The Parisians loved her, however, the Nazis did not. When she went on a tour of Germany and Austria, well, she went on a world tour in the 1930s, the Nazis were throwing ammonia bombs onto the stage while she was performing, and they said in the papers, how dare she appear on the stage with Aryan performers? Well, she had already experienced racism in the States, so she always, after that tour, she always equated Nazism with racism. And so when the war broke out in France, she wanted to do something. She became part of de Gaulle's espionage organization, and so she would travel from place to place as an entertainer, and just an empty-headed entertainer, but she was actually trained to remember facts, and she would write things down. She would write them in her song sheets. She would pin little notes to her underwear. She was always listening for information, and she did a lot of great work for de Gaulle's espionage organization. And when she died in the 1970s, she received full military honors at her funeral. Excuse me. Yeah, next slide. Excuse me. This young lady, well, she was, I think she was in her 30s or 40s, actually, when the war broke out. But she was a hairdresser, and what motivated her to work for the resistance was just the sad thought that when the Germans marched into her little coastal town in France, she didn't have her liberty anymore. She didn't have freedom. She hadn't realized what it was, and I think a lot of us probably would be in the same boat. We don't realize what we have until we lose it. So she was very motivated to join all kinds of resistance organizations, but what she was highly decorated for after the war was the fact that she personally rescued, as part of kind of an escape line, she personally rescued 100 Allied servicemen. And she had all kinds of medals for this. And she died at the age of 105 during 2010 when I was doing the edits. I was in contact with her publisher who published her memoir. And that was very sad, but she really lived a very long life. That was Andre Vierot-Piel. I didn't tell you who that was. This is Andre de Jong, and she was a Belgian woman. She was a nurse in training and a commercial artist when the Germans marched into Brussels. And when they marched into Brussels, she saw her father in tears, and she had never seen him cry before, but this was the second Belgian occupation that he had witnessed. And so she said, "Father," and this is in my book, "don't worry, they started this war, but we're going to end it." And so she noticed that there were some downed airmen hiding, and so she took them and got them civilian clothes, so nobody would know who they were, and if they could just keep their mouths shut, nobody would know that they were either British or what. So anyway, sorry. But what she eventually conceived was this enormous escape line that was 1,000 miles that stretched from Brussels through occupied France, across the Pyrenees Mountains, where they could usually get back to London. And it was called the Comet Line. An escape line is when you would go from house to house, and it was very fast. It was known for its speed. She was eventually captured. I won't tell you if she died or not, but the Germans actually didn't believe that she admitted that she was the leader of the Comet Line. They didn't believe her. Germans were very myopic in that way about women. They didn't at first think that women could be involved in resistance activities. So that made it easy in some ways for resistance women to kind of get out of scrapes. They would just smile and wave, and the Germans would flirt with them, and they would just think it's just another pretty face. They couldn't possibly be, well, they found out later that they were, but they didn't believe that she was in charge of the Comet Line. But because she wouldn't hand out any other names of people involved, they arrested her. But the Comet Line eventually rescued 700 downed airmen, and a lot of them were Americans. Okay, next slide. And this woman is probably famous because she wasn't actually fit to be, she didn't have the personality to be an agent. However, that didn't stop her. She really wanted to do something against Hitler. So she became the first female radio operator sent into occupied France. Her name is Noor Inayat Khan, and her father was a Sufi mystic, and her mother was an American. Her father was also a professional musician. She was very dreamy. She said that her father taught her the worst thing in the world would be to say a lie. This was going to be a problem if she was an agent in an occupied country. But, and nobody thought that she had the right personality. However, she was technically very expert at doing radio work. So she was sent in. It's a sad story. I won't tell you how it ends exactly. But she was a really big name in resistance history. And then, those are some of the big names. I wanted to do, it's exciting. When you have a book, you can decide who people are going to read about it. It's just an incredibly heady experience. And I thought, I don't want just the big names. What about these women that nobody knows about, except, obscure women? This woman, her name is Jootje Vos. Here she is with her husband, Art. And they were Dutch rescuers in a kind of a village area called Laren. And I saw her story in several rescuing books. One is called Conscience and Courage by Eva Fogelman, and one was called Rescuers, Portraits of Moral Courage in the Holocaust. And her story was really great, so I wanted to have her in the book, and I'll talk a little bit more about her in a minute. And I found this woman's story in a book called Sisters in the Resistance, How the Women Fought to Free France from Nazi Tyranny. And her name is Marie Madeleine Fourcade, and she became the head of a 3,000 agent strong French espionage organization. Now, she didn't set out to build this, but the person who was in charge of it was her boss, who was obsessed with espionage. He ran a magazine all about espionage, and he was sure that espionage was the way that they were going to win the war. And so she was second in command to him. So when the Vichy government arrested him, she was in charge. So she had to decide what pieces of information her agents from all over France would send her would be worthy of sending to London. So it was a really great story, very exciting story at one point. And then I kept doing book reviews, because when you find a book and you find kind of a small publisher, they're usually very excited to have anybody willing to write a book review for them. So this is a memoir I found on a woman named Maria Gulevich, and she did a lot of helping some OSS and SOE men escape from the Nazis in Slovakia. And I was very glad to get this young lady's story, because she was a courier, 15 years old when the war broke out. Her uncle was part of a resistance. He did not want her to be part of the resistance. He tried to talk her out of it, but she wanted to do something, anything. And so couriers, young girls, were often used as couriers, and very representative of thousands of young girls who we'll never hear about. The only reason I know about her is because she published her memoir with this small publisher. Her name is Fernindi Koefkens Davis. And this is Muriel Engelman. I found her memoir also while I was doing, I had emails from this book reviewing site that I review for. I was very glad to get her story, because she was a U.S. Army nurse. And Army nurses, biographically speaking, tend to run in packs. And I needed the memoir of one woman. And so I was very glad, very happy to meet her. Now, here she is in Liège, Belgium, during the Battle of the Bulge. And she's got a blackjack in her right hand. In her left pocket, there's a dagger. Those were weapons given to her by her patients, the American GIs, who were stationed there, who had been wounded during the Battle of the Bulge. She didn't think she could actually use them, but she was very glad for their concern. And she's smiling, but she was actually very frightened. She is Jewish. She's still with us, very, very with it in her brain. I wish I could be that well when I was in my 90s, but she was Jewish, and they had to wear dog tags that identified their religion. And so she would have been in serious trouble if the Germans had come. And they were 10 miles away from her tent hospital at that point. It was a general tent hospital. It wasn't a field battle. So next picture. And here she is at the front, and she is, if if you've got one of the books, this picture is on the cover, and she's the one leading the charge. She's very embarrassed that I've said things like Muriel and her nurses. She was not in charge. It looks like she's in charge here, but she said, I'm not in charge, it's just that I had the loudest voice, so I could call the commands, so that's why she's in the front. And this is before they left. They were in Chester, England at this point, before they left for Normandy and before they were in Belgium. And there's if you know what buzz bombs are, she wrote a letter home in her chapter about buzz bombs, and she can really write. She wrote her memoir not only about World War II, but her whole life. She's one of those people that can make anything funny. So I would definitely look her up. It's a really nice memoir. And I didn't know where to put this, but I wanted to tell you about Denmark. And I don't usually talk about Denmark in my talks, but I should, because Denmark was very unusual in that they rose as one person, almost to the man, to rescue their Jews. Now, at first, the Nazis weren't even doing anything in Denmark. The Germans called it the whipped cream front, because it was so easy. They were very nice to the Danes. They considered them perfect Aryans. But some of the Danes thought, you know what, they're still here. Let's do some sabotage. The SOE said, we'll supply you. So the Germans finally got fed up with all the sabotage, and they said, we're going to move against the Jews. And the Danes rose up. This is very representative of a lot of what the underground press was. The underground press was very important in resistance because it inspired people to realize that other people were also trying to resist. Plus, it printed things other than just Nazi propaganda. This is Free Denmark. And I think this says events drawn near Denmark. And I can't remember the rest of it, but it's translated in the book. This picture's in the book. And so everyone that was involved in other resistance activities, when the move came against the Jews, they stopped what they were doing, and everyone rescued the Jews, sent them to Sweden, and the Germans just left them in Sweden. That's kind of a complicated story, but next. Oh, and what I was going to say about Denmark was that I had my chapters reviewed, the introductory chapters reviewed by a friend of mine from high school who has become a professor of 20th century European history. I wanted to make sure I got everything right. And she reviewed this chapter. She said, oh, it's fine. I don't know anything about Danish history. Nobody does in World War II. So I thought, well, I got my information from several books on Danish history, but I sent it to the Danish Resistance Museum through email. I don't know how people wrote books like this before email, but it's made it so much easier. And he actually found some errors in it, so I was really glad I sent it to him. So Little Denmark was really quite noble. Now, this is the part of the story called Touching History. It got very exciting for me. I wanted to have this picture in the Sophie Scholl chapter. And I had to find all the pictures myself. I don't know if that's normal or not, but for me, I was overwhelmed as it was. I had 24 chapters to write in 12 months, and first-time author, I wasn't sure if I could actually pull it off. I did, but I also had to find the pictures. It turned out to be a very exciting blessing in disguise because I got a lot of communication with people. So I found out that the people who owned the rights to this picture are those at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. They said, if you want the picture, you're going to have to call this guy, George J. Wittenstein, on the West Coast. So I gave him a call. And a very heavily German accented man answered the phone, and he said, you're going to have to send me the chapter because there's been a lot of erroneous material written about the Scholls. I sent him the chapter through snail mail, and he sent it back. He said, what did you use to base your story? And I told him the book, and he said, that book was based on interviews by Inga Scholl, the older sister of the two Scholl siblings, who was actually a Nazi or a Nazi sympathizer, and who knew nothing about the White Rose, but after the war she pretended that she did to kind of deflect questions about her actual sympathies. So he said, I would suggest taking this other book that's been regutted, rewritten, and researched by another team of researchers and rewrite your story. So I did. I sent it back to him. He said, that's great. All through and he said, you have to put my name under the picture as the copyright holder. So I was talking on the phone to the guy who snapped this picture of the Scholz, one of the most revered people in Germany. It was very, very exciting. He left a message on the answering machine. I was trying to figure out how to keep it permanently. I don't know how to do that. But anyway, it was very exciting to meet him. And I was very excited. This is them again. This is another picture that he took. They just look like carefree college students. But at this point, they had to stop the White Rose activities and go to the Russian front to work as medics for 6 months. So they had to stop their university studies and their work in the White Rose. Okay, and this is Hannie Schaft. Now I knew that she was a very important saboteur and assassin in Dutch resistance history, but I didn't have anything in the English language but one website. So I thought, I'm going to start somewhere, so I took all these automatically translated Dutch websites, which were very difficult to read, but I got the basic facts. I got them all on my screen, and I created an article. I created a chapter on Hannie Schaft, and I thought, I'm uncomfortable with putting this in the book. So I located through the web the Hannie Schaft Memorial Foundation in the Netherlands. And I sent it to them, and they said, this is a very good article. This is a very good chapter. A couple of little spelling errors. And I said, oh, I've got someone to ask questions about Hannie Schaft. So I was very excited, and I kept asking her questions. She said, I'm going to refer you to someone else in our foundation who knows more about Hannie. So she referred me to a gentleman named Paul Elzinga, and we started an email correspondence. And he liked the chapter as well, but he said, do not call it The Girl with the Red Hair. I had given the chapter that title because that's the name that the Gestapo gave her, because she was spotted during several assassination attempts and she had red hair. He said, she did not have red hair, she had auburn hair. I said, wow, he knew her. He was a 10-year-old when Hannie was staying in his home. She was an underdiker, someone who was on the run and had changed her identity. And he said her hair was very beautiful. And that was exciting to me that he had known her. And he sent me a memoir that one of her associates had written about her, and it had several quotes directly from Hannie. It just made the chapter come alive, so I was very excited to meet with him. And the next slide is something he sent me over the internet. That's Hannie in the middle, the tiny one. And she came from a very close-knit family because the older sister had died, and she was very shy, but the woman knew how to handle a gun. And she and her cohorts actually did a lot of assassination on Dutch traitors. You think of the Dutch as these nice people who hid the Jews, but the Nazi party was very big in the Netherlands, and so they usually would shoot the traitors who could turn more resistance people in. So, okay, next slide. And here is Jochi Voss again. Art is pointing to the Allied planes. This is after the war. They rescued 32 hiders. Some of them were Jews, some of them were other people on the run from the Nazis. The two little girls in front of Art are their children, and then the boy is their son. Everyone else in the picture are Jews that they rescued. And as I mentioned, I saw her story in several different books. I also found a website that had a 30-minute interview of her, which is very, very good. But I kept seeing references to a memoir that she had written called The End of the Tunnel, because there was a tunnel that went from their house into the woods, and so the hiders would always run there when the Gestapo came calling, and they kept coming calling because they knew something was going on. And I could never find the memoir anywhere, and then a fellow writer put me in touch with the tiniest little blonde girl who's now in her 70s and living in upstate New York, and she sent me a copy of the memoir. She liked the chapter. I sent her the chapter, and she said it was fine, except I got the length of the tunnel wrong, so I changed that. And here's Deet Iman, whose memoir I had read in the 1990s, and it had been co-authored by a former professor of mine. And so I contacted him, and I said, I need some pictures of Deet Iman. And so he put me in contact with her. She lives in Grand Rapids at this time. And I said, I need a picture, and she said, sure. And she sent me these original photographs, these tiny little, from the 1940s with the little white all around them, and I got them in the mail. I didn't realize she'd be sending me actual photos. I thought they'd be copies. So I felt like I was holding the Dutch resistance in my hand. It was very, very exciting. This is a picture. It's not in the book. This is her fiancé, Hein Seidsma, in their father's garden. That's what they call backyards in the Netherlands, the garden. Okay, and finally, I needed pictures on Marlene, wartime photos. And I didn't know where to look, but I looked at a website, and a couple people referred me to someone named Peter Riva. So I started a communication with him, and we were exchanging emails, and suddenly I recognized the name Riva. Her daughter was named Maria Riva, and I said, "Are you her grandson?" He said, "Yes, he's just a owner of a literary agency in New York City and Arizona." But he gave me several pictures. I think Marlene has 4 pictures in her chapter. The next one as well. Oh, this is her behind enemy lines when she was during the Battle of the Bulge. And then the next one, she was entertaining the troops in Italy. She was a tireless performer. And I didn't actually have to pay for the pictures. The publisher had to send him 5 copies of the book afterwards, so that was kind of cool. Okay, so the next one. And finally, I talked to the little girl in the braids because I wanted the story of this family. This is Andre and Magda Trocme, and they had a rescue operation. They spearheaded a rescue operation in the south of France on this plateau, that enormous plateau that had 11 different tiny villages, and they were all involved in rescue activities. Now, he wrote a book, or a book was written about him, but he left a paper trail. And this ethicist, after the war, was very depressed about how could the Holocaust happen. And it is a very depressing subject. It's totally depressing. So he went to find out what this was all about. He was an ethicist, not a historian. And so the book he wrote was not historically accurate. And the little girl in the picture has made it her mission in life to correct factual errors about her parents' story. So when I came into contact with her, she said, "I am going to have to see your story." And so, of course, I based it on the Halley book, the ethicist book, so we had a lot of fun conversations back and forth. But she's very happy with the chapter at this point in time, and she likes her copy. And the story of Andre and Magda Trocme. I tried to focus more on Magda because it's about heroines, but the story is now brought to the world. Now, the last question is, what am I working on next? This woman's story is in the book. She is Pearl Witherington. And I knew she was very big in SOE resistance history, but I couldn't find anything about her except a bunch of websites. And you know, if you notice the websites, they tend to kind of duplicate each other. So when I first started this, I thought if I had 3 websites, I could write a chapter. That's not true because they say exactly the same things. So I thought, how can I find out more about her? Well, she had a memoir that was published in French because she was born and raised in Paris, but she had English parents. So I said to my husband, "John, would you do this for me?" Because he's the kind of guy that never forgets anything he learns. He had an excellent French teacher in high school. So I said, "Would you be willing to kind of get this memoir for me and write up something that I can use for my chapter?" So he said, "Fine." And we became very excited about this story. So excited, as a matter of fact, that we found out John kept, the French journalist who did the Q&A originally with her and John kept up this correspondence, and they became good friends. We found out that there is an English translation, it just doesn't have a publisher. So the Chicago Review Press said, if you take it from Q&A and put it into a narrative form, and put introductory comments about the SOE and about every different aspect of her resistance work, we will publish it. And so we're just putting the finishing touches on that, and it should come out next spring. And the next picture is Pearl and her husband, Henri. She was a courier for the SOE, but then the organizer was arrested, and so she became an organizer. She was organizer of a huge amount of Maquis fighters in the south of France. And it's funny because the SOE files have become public a few years ago, so we've been looking in her SOE files, all kinds of different letters to her mothers, just hundreds of documents. But one of the documents I found recently said, she said something about 1,000 Maquis, that's too many. She was actually in charge of more than that by the war's end. So she was very straight-talking, no-nonsense person, and she finally allowed her memoir to be published. And that is the end of the talk. Oh, I'd like to do one more thing before I leave it to you for your questions. People say, what does it take to be a hero? Well, I hope it gave you a little bit of an idea. These people just were where they were. They did what they could from the starting point of where they were. So I'm just going to read you the last 2 paragraphs of the introduction. The women whose stories are featured in this book are not the only female heroes of World War II. There were hundreds of thousands of women who fought against the Nazi regime in many different ways. Some of them are remembered only by a short chapter in a book, others by a paragraph on a website. The stories of thousands more might never be known. But most of these women, the famous and the obscure, had one thing in common. They did not think of themselves as heroes. They followed their consciences, saw something that needed to be done, and they did it. And all of them helped win a war, even though many of them paid the ultimate price for their contribution. But their sacrifice was not in vain, especially if their courage continues to inspire others to fight injustice and evil wherever they find it. So that is my talk. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
But since it was written in the 50s, it doesn't say a whole lot about what she did after the war. Is there very much? I know she went into political life in Australia.
Right.
Did she continue that for the rest of her life? Do you
Well,
know?
if you could, I don't think she actually won. I don't think she tried to go in political life. I didn't delve very deeply into that part of her life, but I do remember that. She wrote a memoir, which gets into that quite a bit, and there's another book written after the
print.
memoir. Pardon me?
It's out of print.
Yeah, I know. I got
As
the
a
last
used book,
reasonably
it's very
priced.
expensive.
Yeah. I think what she said was, I just reread parts of the memoir recently, and she felt like she went back to Australia a little too soon because people in Australia she had been in the thick of the war, and people in Australia had not been. So she felt like she returned too fast, and I don't believe that she actually won, but she came very close. So, yeah, and then she eventually moved back to London. She died in a retirement community in London last summer.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Oh.
The person to come around to the mic.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk this evening. You mentioned several times about getting involved in doing book reviews. If someone wanted to do that, how would they go about doing it?
Well, I would start with Amazon because I started with Amazon and I was terrified to put 2 sentences together. It was just so hard at first because I just wasn't used to writing anymore. But I would suggest Amazon, and then you have a published clip, because Amazon does publish everything. From there I went to bookpleasures.com, and he'll take anyone, but he wants to see some published work. So I would definitely start just reviewing where you can review. Goodreads is another place that anybody can write a review, goodreads.com. I would go there, and then Book Pleasures, curledupwithabook.com is another site that will take people, they just want to see a little bit of a published clip, and it can be an Amazon review. Yeah, that's basically what I would do. Yeah.
Yourself working on many of the women at the same time, or did you fixate on one and
I would
see her
fixate
through?
on one, but it would take, I was aiming for 2 a month. And I actually wrote 3 chapters that I didn't use, so it was very busy, but at first it was a little harder, and then I kind of got the swing of it after a while. So I usually did 2 a month, sometimes 3. Thank you. Anybody else?
I think you were saying that a lot of your contacts were made through the internet, locating somebody who knew somebody. Is that what you were saying?
Well, yeah, like the Hannie Schaft Memorial Foundation, I found them through the internet. I'm not sure your question, actually. I don't know.
Is the internet the main way that you made further contact with people, or were there other ways that you made contact with somebody who could give you more information about the women that you wrote about?
Okay, the internet, definitely, yeah. I would get their email, and we would correspond. And it's kind of fun corresponding with Europeans, because they were always emailing you at 3 o'clock in the morning because it's about 6-hour time difference. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Okay. I had to do snail mail with a couple people, but usually it was email.
Get to meet personally? Anybody?
Up face to face? I didn't get to meet anybody face to face. Muriel Engelman and I still correspond through email. Indeed, Iman and I talked on the phone. And I remember when I did, a lot of the women died in the 2000s. So most of them that survived the war died in the 2000s. And I remember when the book first came out, there were 4 women still alive. Oh yeah, Fernandi Kufkins, the little Belgian courier, she's still with us, I believe, but I didn't even communicate with her, I just communicated with her publisher, because I don't think she does email with people other than just the publisher. And Nancy Wake was still alive when the book came out for a few months. And so Deet, Iman, and Muriel were the only women that I actually communicated with, either via snail mail or on the phone. And I did talk to Muriel on the phone once. Yeah, she's very funny, and she wanted to tell me the songs that they sang. Because we have, in our History Singers program, I have a blog called The Song's the Thing. And so they would entertain themselves by creating different lyrics to familiar tunes, which of course we've all done that, and she wanted to sing them for me in her raspy voice. It was really fun.
Do you have only one chapter on the nurses?
Right, she's representative of the nurses. Exactly, yeah. Muriel Engelman's chapter in the U.S. section.
Thanks, JD. One of the interesting things when you read in a biography or memoirs or things like that is how memories get clouded and or slanted. How did you fact check, and how much digging did you do in your fact checking?
Well, like I said, I had the professor of 20th century history fact check all the introductory chapters. And then all the chapters I could, if I found someone, I said, please look at this chapter and let me know. And sometimes I couldn't find anybody, and so I would just go back to this. I wrote the chapter, and then before I turned it in, I read the source material again and again, and I just made sure that at least it matched up to the material that I used it in, that I used to base the chapter on. So I think about half of the chapters were fact-checked by people who knew the people or were familiar with them. And I had enough of those people say, this is a good chapter, you misspelled one word or something. So that gave me a little more confidence. When I based it on erroneous material, such as with the Shoals and with Magna Trocme, then I was very glad I had someone to discuss that with. But another thing I tried to do is find more information, not just one source. Like a memoir, but then I would use a biography as well and fact check those against each other. And sometimes they just didn't check out. Like Nancy Wake's memoir says that she did this bike ride. This bike ride is the biggest thing that she did in the war. You think she did so much, but her memoir says it was 500 kilometers, whereas her biographer, who wrote a book 15 years later, said it was 400 kilometers. I kind of thought he got a few things wrong. He kind of misquoted her according to, but how do I know? She spoke with him, but then she wrote a memoir 15 years earlier, so which one was right? I put 500 in there because she had that in her memoir, and it being a woman's book, I thought I'd take her word for it. He was a guy, so I don't know.
Let's take one more question. There's one over here.
When you were researching these women, and you read their memoirs or other reports, did they connect and give you, that you could read, names of other people that they worked with? And did that ever lead you, to include someone like that?
I don't think that happened. No, I only really spoke to, well, yeah, I spoke to the children and the friends. No, that didn't happen because I think they knew I was focused on the particular woman, so they were helping me get her story straight. There were obviously other people involved, and I mentioned them as much as I could. There are a lot of, in the introductions, I have a lot of sidebars on women. I tried to just cram as many women in there as I could, because there's thousands of women, we'll never know what they did. They didn't talk about it afterwards, they didn't write a memoir, how are we ever gonna know? So I tried to cram as many women, even in sidebar form in the introductions, as I could. There was another question. Oh.
Sorry, I was just curious, and this is probably showing how little history I've looked at outside of high school, but what is a courier?
Sorry, I probably did not. Okay, courier. They would take information, sometimes they memorized message or documents from place to place. It was very key in resistance work because phone lines were tapped, mail was sorted through, and also because men and girls were couriers. And the reason that is because men were supposed to be hard at work in German munitions factories, men from the occupied countries. They were first invited, then they were forced, and it was basically slave labor. But the girls were not as in demand for work in the munitions factories, and so girls were used to take messages from place to place. If you were a guy in the resistance in an occupied country, you would come under suspicion for being out in the open because what were you doing there? You're supposed to be in Germany. So the girls would put messages in their bicycle, they would memorize them, they would take documents. There's 2 courier stories actually in the book, and they were both Belgian. But couriers were used by every resistance organization during the war. Did that answer your question? Okay, great.
Okay, Catherine has very graciously offered to stay afterwards. She may be able to entertain a couple more questions, but she's going to sign copies of her book at the table to our right, to your left, behind you, and the books are for sale at the table to our left. So Catherine, you saved an important piece of history, and we're grateful to you for that, and we're grateful to all the women that you wrote about and all those unknown that they represent who helped win World War II. So thank you so much. And I see when you talk, you like to have a drink of water, as I do, and the next time you talk, you can have it from this beautiful little souvenir bottle, which you will never lose because this is the big, thank you, the big red one. There you go. I'll take that back. So thanks very much. A couple of quick announcements before we get out of here. I've talked about the book signing. There's an evaluation sheet on your seats. Please fill them out and put them in the black plastic tray on the table on the right as you go out. This is our next Date with History on May 2nd, Arn Armor, the story of armor technology. I don't know why we're doing that, but J.D. Kamez in the back here who puts all these events together, and who, by the way, found Catherine, found her book, and invited her. Good job. But he's an old tanker, and he thinks we need to talk about tanks. And finally, next slide, please. I think as many of you know, this is a free event, but there's a table in the back manned by the members of Cantini Post 556 of the American Legion. They have a red, white, and blue mailbox in which we will gladly accept any spare change. All of that money will go to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans in Wheaton, a wonderful grassroots nonprofit organization that does tremendous good for our community and for veterans who are a little down on their luck. And you can also pick up literature about it there if you're interested. Thank you so much for coming. See you on May 2nd. Thank you, Catherine. Well done.
Oh, thank you.